Dungeon masters regularly build their own worlds and write their own rules to better fit the game for their group. But what happens when the DM is not only a bad rule writer, but also incredibly inconsistent? Just before we roll post on this, a quick shout out to today's sponsor. Tainted Grail is a Twilight fantasy universe inspired by Arthurian legend and Celtic mythology. If you're familiar with board game titles like The Fall of Avalon or Kings of Ruin, or either of the Tainted Grail video games, then you already have a foot in the door with this franchise. Now, Awaken Realms and Studio Agate join forces to write a new chapter in the Chronicle of Avalon, presenting Tainted Grail TTRPG Song of a Dying World, a tabletop role-playing game set in a unique grim world. Play as one of the last survivors of humanity after a terrible cataclysm, learn to survive and face the dangers of the mysterious island of Avalon. Players take on the roles of protectors, standing as humanity's only hope in a dying world. Learn the setting, rules, and experience your first adventure with a free PDF. So what are you waiting for? Join over 2,000 backers with the link below. This tale begins in a Discord server. Our group is like many others. Most days after work we get on Discord and play video games. Then, one of us offers to start a D&D campaign. We all had different levels of experience with the game. Some of us only played once, others played for years. The DM has played some campaigns, but clearly not enough, as things took a turn for the worse due to the DM's homebrew rules. For Session 0, he informed us that there were so many homebrew rules that it would be easier to address them as they came up, rather than all at once. But the point he wanted us all to understand was that the system was meant to be realistic. The setting was pretty generic, so there wasn't much discussion of that either. So Session 0 was more about us players designing our characters and weaving backstories. The first session started innocently enough. Our characters met in a tavern, and I was surprised at how good our chemistry and roleplay was from the start. However, as soon as we encountered our first combat scenario, the homebrew rules became a problem. As it turns out, the DM had altered pretty much the entire combat system. In place of the simple 5e rule set, we now had a convoluted set of rules that made the battles more confusing than strategic. First, the grid was turned into hexes, which, it was weird, but that was the least of our problems. Hit points were divided between all of the body parts, so before you attacked you had to choose which body part you were aiming for. Also, different body parts had different armor classes, which was weird. I'd be lying if I said the idea of a VAT system in D&D doesn't sound really cool to me. One of the appealing things about D&D is that you can change a lot about the game without causing it to be unplayable. But one of the only things you should tread carefully when changing are the fundamentals of combat. Combat is the one part of the game where everything about D&D connects. There can be exploration, roleplay, and combat, skill checks, saves, plot development. Everything in the game is laid out for you right there. Homebrewing some combat rules is perfectly fine, but changing the core basics of combat is one of the only times I think, is this really a good idea? Because of this system, my rogue's sneak attack got nerfed from D6s to D4s. He justified this by telling me that if my sneak attack was intact, I would be able to completely disable a limb with every single sneak attack. Okay, you see, this is what I meant. This is exactly what I meant. This is like when you remove one of the bottom Jenga blocks that supports the whole system, so it all comes crashing down. If every attack needs to be delivered limb by limb, then the entire way combat is done needs to be reworked. It can be done, but at that point, why not just play a different game? Of course, we were learning all of this for the first time. But the DM is a great friend, and I wanted to trust the process, so I chalked this up as a bad start. Attempts to address the balance issues were met with resistance from the DM, who argued that the campaign was meant to be challenging. However, it felt less like a challenge and more like arbitrary restrictions. The campaign had peaks and valleys, the roleplay and world building was excellent, but the combat and anything involving actual game mechanics was inconsistent and overcomplicated. The lack of consistency in the homebrew rules became a recurring issue. A house rule in one session was sometimes slightly altered in the next, leaving us confused. Opportunity attacks were always to be rolled at a disadvantage because the DM says you're hitting a moving target. This rule gets thrown by the wayside later, as you will see. At this point, I was running out of patience for the DM, my benefit of the doubt was wavering, so I made it my goal of the week to get full clarification from the DM. Attempts to seek clarification were met with vague responses, and the DM seemed unwilling to establish clear guidelines. It reached a point where the campaign felt more like a chaotic experiment than any sort of narrative. At one point, I asked the DM up front for a doc of the rules so I could read all of them myself. I didn't care if it took me 10 minutes or 10 years, I just wanted the final clarification. He then admitted that he kept the rulebook in his memory. Okay, full stop, emergency brakes. Isn't this just kind of admission that he's arbitrarily applying rules he hasn't thought through? It's one thing to have a couple agreed upon house rules on hand, it's another thing to have an entire book worth of overcomplicated rule systems and not even put it on paper. If he's keeping the rules in his head and inconsistently applying them, that's dumb at best and twisting the game to force outcomes at worst. I then asked him to write it down so we can all be on the same page, and he agreed. Fast forward 3 sessions and he still hasn't gotten around to writing it. Then the DM tries to recruit one more player to the game, and I don't know how he thought this one was a good idea. The friend he invited isn't a bad person, but he knows what he wants and isn't afraid to say it. If he dislikes something, he will say it to your face without hesitation, which sometimes hurts people's feelings. He's also super competitive and hates losing. This is dynamite to the flame that is inconsistent rulings. He rolled up a gnome wizard, and the eventful session 5 began. A session to remember. Because of the events of this session, some context is required. While his rules were more bad than good, at this point he only changed the rules twice, denying it both times. Also, the game was fun whenever dice rolls were not involved, so we weren't itching to quit yet. The real Hoarder's story begins here. Okay, he denies the rule changes, but he genuinely might be forgetting. DMing takes a huge amount of your brain space for the entire game, so juggling that while trying to apply convoluted rules that you haven't committed to paper is more difficult. I'm not ruling out the possibility that he's being intentionally unfair, but if he refuses to write them down, this is 100% his bad, and I can't exactly fault OP for coming to their own conclusions. I can't really get a read on the DM just yet, but I hope that he's just a newer DM, maybe a little lazy or overwhelmed, and doesn't know what it is that he's doing. In the beginning of the campaign, we were marked by a vampire cult. To prevent ourselves from losing our memories and becoming thralls, we had to find an antidote at the bottom of a dungeon. At this point, we had spent 2 sessions in the dungeon and had made decent progress when we met Gnome, the competitive new guy I mentioned earlier. We met his character in the dungeon. He was delighted to find non-hostile creatures this far in. We struck a deal. He would lead us to the bottom of the dungeon, and we would lead him back to the surface. Strength in numbers. This is about where the game ended and the Hoarders began. I forgot to mention something. Gnome is a massive stickler for the rules. He was informed that there was some homebrew, but he had no idea what was in store. Combat begins. Gnome's character is the first PC in initiative order, but after he was attacked by an enemy, they fled, prompting an attack of opportunity. So before rolling, the DM asks, "Okay, what body part do you target?" "What? Which body part do you target? It's a house rule." I don't know, the head?" "You sure? Headshots are rolled with disadvantage." "What? Wait, fine. I'll thrust for his torso." "Okay, it's a hit. You've broken through his armor and gutted him, breaking a bone or two on your way in." The DM then explained the concept of broken limbs to Gnome. Different limbs breaking causes different debuffs. You could tell that Gnome was not a fan of this, but he surprisingly held his tongue. It wasn't until the debuffs happened to him that this became a problem. At one point, there was a dungeon room that collapsed. There was a highly convoluted system that involved using the battle grid and trajectory of the falling rocks to dodge accurately. It took about 15 minutes, plus the time to learn the system. Some of us got bruised by the falling debris, but none got hurt more than Gnome. Gnome's leg got caught by a falling rock. Remember when I said player HP is split between limbs? Well, because he's a level 2 wizard, he has 4 hit points per limb, so it doesn't take much at all to permanently crush him. The DM told us that this was a tier 3 injury, completely destroying his leg. We were 5 sessions in and did not know that there were tiers to bodily injury. What we learned is that if a limb has a tier 3 injury, you have disadvantage on all rolls until the limb is replaced. And because it's a leg, he can no longer walk without assistance. The gnome said that these homebrew rules are all garbage, and we all felt a rant incoming, so we told the DM to keep the game moving. We arrived at the bottom of the dungeon. The antidote was in sight, a tree. Its leaves would heal us, but it was guarded by a Cerberus. It was asleep, so we sent our stealthiest member, me, to get the antidote. I needed to pick enough leaves off of the tree to heal all 5 of us. I had to pass a stealth check to get there, and a sleight of hand check to pluck a leaf. Success. But that wasn't enough. The DM said I needed 5 leaves, so I had to roll 4 more times. Inevitably, I rolled poorly. The DM narrates. The Cerberus awakens, the 3 heads staring you down. It growls, foaming at the mouth. You know there is no beating this monster. You need to run as fast as you can. Wait, what? I could sort of get it if you're a brand new DM and you're really trying to force a boss fight. So, you throw in some impossible skill checks to give the illusion of chance. It's bad form, but new DMs have done worse. But assuming the DM thought this through, he tried to force a chase scene while a character is injured in the leg. Also, why with the sleight of hand checks? If it's as simple as picking a leaf from a tree, that should be trivially easy to do stealthily. To wake up a Cerberus, you would need to be yanking the leaves off of the tree. I think the DM had a chase scene in mind, but is either forgetting the injured leg, or I don't know. That last sentence confused us. One of us has to be slowed so we can haul Gnome out of here. But we also have to run? We started discussing amongst ourselves if we're supposed to run or fight, when the DM pulled a timer out. We had to make a decision in real time in 25 seconds. We considered hiding, but we don't have any head start to speak of. We considered running, but that would guarantee at least Gnome dies, unless we try to carry him, which would kill 2 of us. So we agreed to fight. Internally, I wasn't afraid of dying in the game anyways, because this game was not that enjoyable, and having Gnome around added stress to the game. So, we rolled initiative. First round, Cerberus hits us for a lot of damage. This massively skews the game out of our favor, because now we have wounds that make us worse at fighting. Second round, we hit the Cerberus a few times. The DM waived the opportunity attack house rule just so that we could get a couple more hits in. The combat was even more awkward than before, because the DM was trying not to kill anyone, while still applying rules that hurt our chances of survival, but not applying the opportunity attack rule. It was weird. With each passing turn, you could feel everyone on call get more annoyed. The voices became less interested, and people were more about quickly passing their turn than actually engaging with the game, except for Gnome. He was fuming in his seat. While everyone else was mentally checked out of the game, he was telling other players what to do. The Cerberus would beat someone up, a lot, and then inexplicably move on to the next guy without finishing the job. After just a couple more rounds, we reached an agitating stalemate. The DM was unwilling to finish us off, but we had so many broken limbs that we could just barely fight and move, and even those were filled with penalties. Suddenly, something came up and the DM had to leave, telling us the game will pick up again next week. It's been a month. We all still hang out and play video games, but nobody is asked about starting the campaign again, and the DM hasn't mentioned it. If I had to guess, the DM wasn't malicious, but he has all the marks of a new DM that has a vision he just can't execute on. If a new or aspiring DM was watching this and wanted to get some advice out of it, mine would be learn the basics so that you understand why they exist. If this DM was new, of course he wouldn't understand why changing combat that massively is a bad idea. So, start with the basics, then you'll learn what you can change and why. Anyways, till next time.